And at the end, I'm just going to give a quick announcement about our IndieCade Fund Drive, which starts on the 7th. So without any further ado, I'd like to start our conversation today with Fourcast. They are a group out of the University of Chicago. They won the IndieCade Live site-specific award this year for their fantastic game Terrarium, which I am totally blown away by, which is why I picked them as my first guest. They're an incredible interdisciplinary team. So I think we should maybe start with a video, which sort of puts the team in context and talks a little bit about a terrarium and some of your other work. Sound good? Okay, Nico, you want to roll the video?
The Fourcast Lab started in 2017 as a collaboration between University of Chicago faculty, game designers, and artists.
It was initially a fictitious group of scientists, artists, and academics that we put together as part of the ARG Terrarium. And then it became the name of the design group.
We create alternate realities that experiment with some of the most pressing issues of our time, from social justice to climate change.
We're really invested in the development of community by communities and building worlds that invite players to participate.
And so the narratives of these games are stitched together and co-created with players.
We believe that story is transformation, and it challenges us to keep going and keep designing. We design large-scale transmedia alternate reality games.
And you're moving between an email and a live stream and a live performance and an online puzzle and Discord and Slack.
Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Zoom.
We've experimented with online rabbit holes, reverse escape rooms.
We are developing an acting style that draws from improv as well as gaming cultures.
The project was very experimental, and it was one of the first times that we integrated live actors.
The Parasite was phenomenally successful at creating a large-scale world that shifted from virtual to in-person spaces. And what we learned is the demands of in-person performance, as well as the ability that players could easily connect and shift through different medias.
In 2019, we created Terrarium. Many universities have a shared book that all students read in a given year. And we thought to ourselves, why not have a shared game? And so we organized the incoming class at the University of Chicago around the shared goal of combating climate change.
With Terrarium, we were able to harness the power of Twitch so that players were able to interact with 4 different possible futures and the characters who lived there.
We were really honored and lucky later on to win an award from IndieCade for the best live action game that year.
The Fourcast Lab has been a place where we've been developing these very particular kinds of games that are these wonderful sites of interdisciplinary discovery and experimentation.
They provide that agency for players to, take learning and take control of a situation and run with it.
It's no longer just this passive experience, but it really inspires your audience to be a part of it.
It feels like anything could happen. Media can be combined in all kinds of different ways.
In spring 2020, just as the pandemic was taking off in March, we jumped into a new project called The Labyrinth.
We were able to immediately respond to the pandemic based on our previous work.
And we thought of this game as a way of connecting people in a time of need and isolation.
And with Echo, we asked players to take responsibility for each other as well as for themselves. And we were interested in reinforcing behavioral shifts.
This is just the beginning. We've created 4 games now in a university context, and we're really interested in moving toward other audiences and other institutions.
The possibility of designing for arts community, middle schools, corporations, families. The excitement in this work is in scaling the project. Now that we have developed this infrastructure, we can really focus on the story creation and the responsiveness to different audiences.
So inspiring. Really fantastic work, you guys. Oops. Maybe also constrained you somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, starting in about 2016, we started thinking about our first game, The Parasite, which was meant as an intervention into the university orientation. And we thought that was a really great moment because these students were not high school students anymore, not quite college students yet. So it was a really great transitional moment to try to get them to think about issues of difference and dissensus and basically like taking command over these resources that they would have for the next 4 years. And so one of the challenges was, of course, just talking the administration and some of our colleagues into taking this really big experiment without having too many models to draw upon. I mean, of course, there's the amazing USC game Reality Ends Here. And so there were models that we could point toward. But part of the work that we did together in the Parasite project and even more in Terrarium was bringing together faculty and staff who could contribute to the game, maybe not as core designers, but as content experts. So for Terrarium, just to give one quick example, we reached out to every person that we could think of on campus who was working on climate change in one way or another. So this included geophysical scientists, but also an English professor who specialized in climate fiction, and people working on climate ethics, archaeology, environmental policy. So it was about creating a really open, inclusive rubric where people could do what they do best.
I would, add to that too, that I think it also allowed us to think about, like obviously the students were really the target in Parasite, but as the games have gone on, it's really kind of like the larger community around here, right? So people are involving their parents, they're involving their friends, they're involving their children, and I think, staff are playing and professional students, and, it went from kind of thinking about freshmen to thinking about like our kind of community broadly defined. And I think, it was a really great opportunity for us because we got to interact with a lot of different parts of the university and to think about it a little bit more holistically.
I'm just curious across this group, could each of you just say a little bit about your own separate discipline area and work and sort of how that fed into the collaboration?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in an English department and a cinema media studies department, but a lot of my own work has had to do with thinking about game design and video game cultures. And I discovered this form of alternate reality games in the 2000s. And at that point, they were really like a commercial form, a form of viral marketing. And I started seeing these really cool cases of things like World Without Oil that Jane McGonigal and Ken Eklund worked on, for instance, and thinking about like, how could we expand this realm? So that was my way into it, and never dreamed in a million years that we could get this far until I met Heidi, Kristen, Marc, Ashlyn, and we were able to draw from different disciplines.
Ash, what's your background?
Yeah, so my background, I'm formally trained in information technology. So I am a technologist at heart, but I've been working a lot in game design, specifically around like location-based entertainment, which was my formal training for my master's program, but also educational game design and interventions. And I work closely with researchers, faculty to help support their games, but also I work directly with high school students and elementary school students to teach them game design as well. So I'm in this space of web design, game design, and education. And what I really loved about this team is the fact that we can actually take a form of game and use it for other purposes, right? It's not just for entertainment. We can talk about climate change. We can talk about democracy. We can talk about so many things. And we're using this form of a game to represent something else. And a game is like the closest thing that we can call what that experiment really is.
What about you, Kristen?
So I'm a sociologist by training, and my work focuses on gender and sexuality primarily, and really thinking about, ways to kind of transform social inequalities. And, I was really drawn to this because I think, this is an unpopular opinion for an academic to have, but, I really think that academic publishing is kind of on its last legs in a lot of ways. And if you want to have an impact in the world and think about how to make change, you have to think about new formats. And, for me, it's, a lot of my discipline is about pointing out issues and being like, well, if we could change all of this. And, I think that this is much more active. And so I was really excited about the idea of like, kind of what we get to do in the classroom, but on this broader scale of like, how do you actually do this kind of experiential learning, but in this really interesting format that has this capacity to, really make much more change than a journal article that 12 people read.
Heidi?
I come from a background in theater and performance studies, with a special focus on development of new work and really thinking about site-specific performance. So, and also thinking for a long time about how to create programs for undergraduates to really be able to explore agency and their own creative development. And I think that Patrick and I found each other through students really who were taking both of our courses and kept bringing up work that kept crossing over. So that was a kind of really organic and fantastic connection. But now thinking about spaces and kind of how we, and what was exciting about Parasite, and I hope we can get back to at some point or forward to, is being able to create online spaces and shift into physical spaces and back again. So that's something that is just really exciting. And all the while thinking about story and how deeply transformational that can be.
And Marc?
I think I'm formally trained in figuring out how to stay at school as long as possible, but I have a background in physics and AI and things like that. My day job is a new media artist, an experimental filmmaker. A lot of my work has to do with putting technology into performance contexts, things like dance companies, and examining objects and situations from the real world. And this kind of collaboration just put me exactly where I like to be, which is in a situation where I don't actually think I know what I'm doing, but I have something to offer. So new tools, very different collaborators, very different ethics and set of responsibilities to the audience, and just very delightful work.
I'm with you there. I love working in teams where I have no idea what I'm doing. It's my favorite. But it really segues nicely into my next question, because I'm personally very interested in interdisciplinarity. And it sounds like all of you individually are already interdisciplinary in your own right. But I'm wondering, like, what do you think bringing together these disciplines, like bringing a theater person to the table with a communications person, like how did that create something new that wouldn't have been created through any other means?
We have the best disagreements, I think, a lot of the time. Like sometimes just to find a shared vocabulary is such a beautiful mess. I mean, like what a word means in theater and performance is very different from what it means in game design, is very different from what it means in filmmaking and research. And sometimes just having to be in the same room and be like, okay, that's what we all mean. We're looking at the same thing, or we're not. We're looking at two different things. Here's how we can be innovative using that difference. That happens all the time. And we've learned how to, like, I think, fight productively. I don't know what you all think about that.
That's great. I mean, the Playable Theatre project was started with that. Our very first event, the first thing we did was talk about words. And I'm curious, like, what were there some words that came up early on where you went, oh, this means something totally different in theater than it does, say, in game design?
Oh, every word. I mean, I think we share high tolerance and a kind of masochistic way to like work outside of our comfort zone. And but I think that one thing that we've been doing that's really exciting to me, and also I loathe it, is we're continually reinventing a creative structure, so that and when we bring in designers to work with us, they're frequently kind of looking for what they sort of assume is a kind of hierarchical structure. Because when you're creating under time pressure, frequently hierarchy is the default. And that's not the way that we work. So there's a real kind of respect for a sound designer who is asked to kind of work outside of their own comfort zone, but that we trust the work that they're doing, and we're sharing work, but we're not looking over someone's shoulder, because we don't have time to do that. And that is initially really scary, but it's very exciting too. But you know, words like sound designer, in the beginning, it means something different to me than it did to Patrick. And so we're trying to kind of really go back to, when you say sound, what do you mean? Is that but that's so exciting. And I think what happens is there's a synthesis that's not coming from any of our specific backgrounds, but that is starting to get created in the space between.
I mean, some of that also has to do with like acting style. I mean, we've talked a lot about what it means to perform in a live streaming format, or with Twitch in particular, or the kind of new platform that we've been using that's very similar to that. What it means to produce a sense of liveness, but also rich improvisation. So like in early projects, sometimes we were improvising and we were doing things with things that players were throwing at us, but the players didn't necessarily know that. And so part of what we've tried to create is a dynamic feedback loop where the players see that they're contributing to world building and feel really empowered, really agential to be able to play with us, where there's hopefully a leveling between designer and player. And that's something that like we can certainly draw on forms of improv that come from both theater and gameplay, but what we're doing feels different, especially at the level of the human performance.
So that actually also segues to a question, specifically because we're in the Playable Theatre episode. One of the things that I'm really interested in is that as we're starting to see more and more interactive performances, we're calling on actors to do things that are not only challenging, but in many ways antithetical to what they're taught. Like most of the actors, traditional acting training teaches you to ignore the audience And so what would you say were some of the things you learned about, like, here's what actors need to be able to do to be interactors?
This is something that I'm thinking a lot about, and I would love to share. It's so new and changing. I'm really curious about what other people are finding. I think that we brought in, especially for the most recent game, a number of very experienced, sort of traditionally trained performers. So on one hand, you're supposed to ignore the audience, but you're also getting energy from them. You're in a live presence, so you share the room with them. And in the on Twitch or in the platform that Marc is creating, you have a different sense of presence, and you're interacting through an audience through chat. And so they're there through the chat. So you need to be able to be, you kind of use different parts of your brain that actors aren't typically literally reading an audience interaction, but here it's a very verbal medium. So you're having to trust that there are people there, but also bring that input in. And we're trying to figure out that technology of how to make it easy for an actor to kind of get that presence of an audience and be able to respond to it. Because I think the closest we've come to is an improv room where audience can shout out or come up on stage. But even then, how can you hear or and respond with different parts of your brain in a way that is very intimate and live? And the intimacy is also something that we're discovering that is felt by an audience, but not so much by the performer. And so how to kind of create those workarounds.
I mean, two small things to add are just, one is we think a lot about method acting. And so especially in an alternate reality game that lasts for many weeks or many months, we're oftentimes asking certain designers to also be kind of like actors and net prov performers and stuff like that, and live with the character who is usually a slightly different version of themselves over a longer period of time. That's more similar to live action role playing in some ways than many other genres. So that's one thing that we do a lot of. And the other is just playing with different ways of incorporating what the players are doing in real time into the performance. So there's always a structure. We've always rehearsed that structure many times, but a player might say something really, really interesting in the moment, and you may want to run with that. And in some cases, that set of decisions might completely force a rewriting of the rest of the narrative that follows afterwards. So for that, one concept that we've thought a lot about is asymmetrical cooperation. So giving the players one set of tools and the actor another set of tools, so imperfect information on both sides, and having them have to communicate mechanically across that divide in order to do something collaboratively or cooperatively together.
Did you just say net prov?
Yeah, this is a term that comes from Rob Wittig. It's just network improvisation. So it goes back to electronic literature and to forms of improvisation that happen in live chat rooms or virtual worlds or those kinds of things.
So mediated acting, which I think is interesting. One of the groups I want to have on the show, and if probably in March or April, I'm hoping, is Dacha Theater, and they created this piece where it's a game show, and the audience is essentially programming a bot, and the bot is an actor. So they've created this interface that allows a team of audience members to essentially create parameters that become the improvisation script for the actor. And it's very satisfying because you see that the actor do something that you yourself designed into that character, which is, I find, really, really interesting. Let's see here. Oh, this is an interesting question, and I'd love to hear, it'd be great to hear Ash's take on this, especially coming from the communication side, but this is something that's been baffling me a lot, is what does a design document look like? I mean, you sort of alluded to this earlier, and I'm actually creating a library with the Playable Theatre project right now of design documents for live works, because everybody's just making it up as they go along, and they all look completely different. I was just reading Tony and Tina's Wedding. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that. I mean, it kind of looks like a LARP book, and it kind of looks like a play. It's a mashup, that's just from the 80s, obviously, but what does that look like? How do you tell actors what they're supposed to do? How do you tell your sound designers, right, what they're supposed to create? What is the framework for passing your vision on to the other creators you're working with?
Yeah, so, like thinking about your traditional game dev style of document creation, right? Like where you have this large scale document, it's broken down by structures. You have your audio section, you have your gameplay section, your art section. But what I find here is because we are like in this space of like improv, there are multiple documents, and multiple documents are given very specifically to the people who need to hear them or focus on them. Because, sometimes I think the thing that we're working on, and because we're working really closely with one another, it can overwhelm other people who might just be focused on a very specific thing, such that they don't necessarily need all of that information that, that is being created, right? So, Patrick and Heidi, of course, are working as like the directors of the project, have this like large scale overarching plan of, what the narrative is supposed to be, what the gameplay outcomes are supposed to be, right? Kristen has a list of what like our learning objectives are supposed to be, or what it is that we're researching. They're separate in the same folder, of course, because communication is important, right? And Marc is writing out what the code is supposed to be and what that's looking like, right? And so they're all these separate, very large documents, because we have to plan for a lot of different things, because it's still always unclear, well, what are the players going to be doing, right? We don't know from a day-to-day standpoint, but we can try and think about all the different variables that we might interact with. From the web design standpoint, right, I have the website, but for all of the quests, we're coming up with the quests, especially for things like Echo and Labyrinth, a couple of weeks before we release them, because we're in response to what the players are doing, what we think the players should be learning, right? And that's a separate document. So I think it is always going to look different for your performance, for your game. It is going to be, you have to do what's best for your team, what's best for you. And such that I don't think that there can be a template for this, right? If you're not doing things on a website with a platform like what Marc's creating, then the way that we've structured it doesn't actually make sense. You always have to focus on what works for you and your team.
Do you use any either special software or diagram techniques or anything like that? Or is it all just text, or how do you?
It's text. There are images that might have been pulled. We use Google Drive mainly as our place to like put things in. We use Slack as our means of communication to quickly talk to one another while things are happening, either in real time or if we need to quickly discuss things. It's not super high tech at all. And in fact, I think, because we're always moving and building and throwing other things out the window, we want to kind of keep this as like low tech as possible, because we might have to make a change really quickly.
It's interesting to me because in both film and theater, which I have just a little tiny smattering of experience in, the script, the writing usually happens first, right? In game design, it happens first and last. Like you've got the design document, but then you also have the dialogue, right? And I remember when I was working in a film school back in the late 90s, and I was trying to explain to them, no, you don't write the dialogue first. You write it later. And so that was an interesting thing you brought up, Ash, which I wanted to sort of pursue a little bit about this idea that writing is an iterative process and organic. So the writing itself is also improvised. It sounds like you are doing this kind of responsive style where you're actually writing the story as the player activities are unfolding. Can you talk a little bit more about that? It's really exciting.
I think it maps in my experience onto a sort of a new work development process where the playwright is rewriting between rehearsals. Like you might rehearse for a day, and then there's a rewriting that happens, and you come in, and in this case, the while we are working with performers, the players are part of that process as well. So there is a script that has kind of points and a narrative and a kind of whole world that's built. But every day of the gameplay, the script is changing and responding to the players. So it's as if it's not that a game design document doesn't really work. We kind of use like Slack as the like it in process, and then use Drive as a way of sharing. But the game, you can't write it first and then play it. It's the process of playing it that creates it. So the documentaries that we create at the end are the documentation of what it's almost like the final work is completed by the players in interaction with us. So the whole thing to me feels like a kind of immersive sort of Sundance 3 weeks, creating a piece. The players are part of that. In starting that residency, you have a kind of a game plan of where you're going to start, but you don't know where you're going to end up. So it feels.
Is it almost like showing off my limited theater knowledge, a little bit like a co-devising process in a sense, using the devising method, but kind of incorporating the audience into that more?
Very much so. I think very much so. And I think that there are ways that LARPs kind of blur, especially the Nordic LARPs, sort of look at kind of blurred line between game and communal theater or co-created theater. And so I think that that's kind of what we're doing. But there is there is a huge amount of work that we're doing before we start thinking about the world, thinking about the narrative, and that then changes once players start to interact. But like right now we're thinking about what the whole world is that we're going to be, as Patrick said, in a method acting way. We start living that world.
And there are these, rehearsal is so important in the way that Heidi's talking about. And these are like the most stressful, amazing, adrenaline-filled moments in some ways. Like I remember when we were working on Terrarium, we had 4 different worlds that were different versions of the future 30 years from now. And there was like a nuclear world, a climate change world, and a totalitarian world, which was not that hard to imagine at that point. And for each of those, we usually had a couple of weeks before it went live. And so it meant trying out a bunch of things in front of a limited group of play testers. It would never be as many play testers as we would eventually have players. So the scale was always uncertain. But like during that process, we would figure out what the strengths and weaknesses of a particular actor were, for instance, and like playing into the strengths for this format. Or Marc would figure out like, oh, let's add an extra camera over here. And when that extra camera was added, it was like, wow, that opens up an entirely new game mechanic that we didn't realize before. So oftentimes, like we would, as Heidi's saying, have that script up front, but these new kind of like technical and performance affordances that were discovered through that process would oftentimes lead us to lean in a particular direction that we hadn't planned on before. So it's very experimental in the process.
Patrick just used the word experimental.
Okay.
In my corner of the film world, there's actually a pretty clear demarcation between experimental filmmaking and indie filmmaking and Hollywood filmmaking. And if Netflix gives you $3 million for an indie film, they want a storyboard, right? And that's partly you sort of presenting the fact that you know what the hell you're doing. It's kind of a milestone before you get money, but also a document that you then give to a cinematographer and a lighting designer, and then they execute it, right? And we're not doing that. We're not doing that because the medium itself hasn't been invented yet. So it's impossible for us to say, well, this is what it's going to look like, this is what it's going to do, because we're not making something that's been made before. But it is possible to get yourself in a position where you trust the process and the situation that you've constructed because you put a lot of work into it, without knowing what that process is going to get you to.
To me, it's the most fun time to be working in a medium is when it doesn't exist yet. And you don't have any conventions or standards, and you just, like I started doing games in the early 80s and we had no freaking idea what we were doing, and it was such a blast. So But you guys hit on something I think is really interesting, and we're going to talk a little bit later about the sort of transition into the COVID era, but it sounds like you were already learning some things about, there was an article that came out, I don't know if you guys saw this a month or so ago, about how theater makers are now filmmakers. And I've been working on some digital theater projects, and I keep, again, like a great example, Marc, you would love this. I was auditing a class, and I said, I have an idea. Let's put 2 cameras on each actor, which of course in film is not anything exciting or innovative, but in digital theater, it was mind blowing to people, right? So this is a great point to me, where like film and theater suddenly are coming together. I mean, in a weird way, film is sort of the bastard child of theater in a funny way, but then now film skills and understanding the proscenium of the screen and understanding the idea of a camera angle and intimacy. I have a really hard time getting my actors to stay inside of the frame. Like they're always moving into the edge of the frame. And if you have a green screen, it just, the whole world goes hooey when you do that, right? I'd love to hear a little bit about that. Like, how do those film techniques then sort of intersect with the live theater aspect in an interesting way?
Well, I mean, you just said an interesting, I mean, if your idea is, we'll put 2 cameras on all actors simultaneously. We were to maybe we shoot the whole thing like that, 2 cameras following each actor, and then we'll figure it out in post. That sounds like A, a very good idea to me. It sounds like something I'd want to do, and B, completely inadmissible in a filmmaking process, right? I mean, you're just not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to do that.
Also,
because
if it's improvised, you can't fix it in post because there's no post.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. You can't do it in a film context. It's too expensive. You can't do it because there's a history of sort of looking down on multi-camera shoots, right? No one really knows how to light that without it looking like a soap opera. It's a radical idea.
So, like, I'd be curious to hear of a scenario like where you had to think about, okay, you have an actor, but there's a camera. And some of the stuff, as we saw from the video, is happening live in real space between people, but then some of it is happening in a mediated way. If I recall, Patrick, did you guys use a sort of future conceit? Wasn't the media kind of a way to talk to people in the future worlds that you were creating? Is that right? Am I getting?
Yeah, we imagined something called the Spore device that we, in a kind of method way, had devised at the University of Chicago. And rather than allowing us to travel through time, it was a way of opening up a single video and audio channel to a particular future. So there was a kind of multiverse concept where we would open up different futures at exactly the same moment and get the kind of comparative of how people were living differently in all these different spaces.
Very cool. Was it the same characters that would be in different variations of the world, or?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense. So in every world, in Terrarium, there was a character called the Anchor, and the Anchor was someone who was kind of chosen to be able to move through time and space in unique ways. But each version of the character was completely different in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of sexuality, in terms of experience. And so there was kind of a through line in terms of how they were dressed maybe, or some of the same memories, but in fact, their lived experience was completely different. And that comparative allowed us not only to look at different scenarios in some kind of like Cold War sense, but also look at different identities and different lives.
Well, this also, a lot of times the future was very helpful because of the glitch. Which is like the bane of our existence, but has saved us in so many ways. Because when you're communicating through a device that you've only just built with the future, there are frequent difficulties in the communication. So we could always glitch the feed. And Marc has many ways. So there are ways that if we would start to get into issues, we could cut the feed, we could glitch the feed. So the camera itself, it was not static. It was a player as part of this, and frequently the performers were working with the camera or cameras as a kind of mediated through the future, but that this is the method part. It's difficult to communicate from the future to our present. And so there are problems that arise.
And this raises a really important point, which is we also, for certain worlds, we would combine kind of like live action, almost inverse escape room gameplay with pre-recorded video that would also enter and allow us to expand the space of the game. So rather than playing only in one room or 4 versions of the same room, there were also like other characters and other temporalities that could be brought in. And there we were using like 100% film techniques and just incorporating them or kind of nesting them within the kind of live action space. And sometimes when players were in that room experiencing the pre-recorded video, operating with a live actor, they would also be on Discord or Slack communicating with other players. So the kind of the not just the transmedia nature of it, but the multi-screen, multi-platform nature was really central to how the story was conveyed and layered.
What Heidi was
Okay.
what Heidi was talking about is actually the inside out of what I was talking about at Netflix. And it's related to what the other half of theater has become during the pandemic, which is we're accustomed to Netflix at this point. We're accustomed to watching stuff that's really well shot, or at least all uniformly competently made. The cameras are expensive and the lighting is good. And there's a lot of non-live theater, which has sort of ended up on the internet, which on the one hand is exciting because you get to see stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be able to see. On the other hand, sort of fails to meet the bar set by all the other stuff that I can watch on TV. It tries to play that game and kind of fails. It isn't well lit because it was theatrically lit. It isn't well shot. It isn't particularly well edited. So part of what we had,
and then it's not even live.
And it's not even live, right? I mean, right. It has a sort of same status as an object, and it's just kind of inferior to watching Queen's Gambit or something. So we're desperately trying to not do that. In addition to being live, we're trying to say, well, okay, this screen that we have is different from the other screens that you have just come from and are going to. The rules are different. It might cut out at any time. It has a different kind of fragility to it. Other things, your relationship to it is very different. And it's been really enjoyable to work that out. I'd love to shoot something that looked as good as Netflix, but it's very hard.
One of the words I was thinking about earlier when you guys were talking that I think you're sort of referring here to, Marc, here, which is also interesting, which is the word diegetic, which we use a lot in game design to talk about, especially in a video game, like what's on the screen that's in the world versus out of the world. I know that in film and theater, that word has slightly different meaning, but I'm really interested in the idea of the diegetics of the screen. Like if we're in a live interaction through a screen, why? And is that screen part of the world that we're interacting through? It sounds like you really came up with a fantastic conceit to make that screen a part of the world and also to accommodate the inherent technical fuzziness of that window into the alternative universe.
I think we came up with really good description for conveyance to our players of the diegesis of the screen. We also had sound that had, as far as I could tell, no excuse, which was really important. I mean, the sound was, it did all of the things that great audio does. I'm talking about music. It really gave sort of an emotional payload to, all 3 things that we've used sound designers for. And yet that was actually, there was no good excuse as to why a communication system to the future would come with its own music. I don't know.
Why each world would have a different soundtrack.
Yeah, we got away with it. And it was, definitely the difference between adding the music and not was, but yeah, it went unnoticed and uncommented on by our players, I think.
I would say that this is like the great benefit of like having people play games, right? There are a lot of weird, illogical things that happen in games all the time that nobody questions, right? And so like, why is there a soundtrack with many of the games that we play, when in the game world, there is not an orchestra behind you. There's no jazz band. That doesn't actually exist. And yet people just accept it for what it is. And so there's like this really cool like interspace that we're in with this we're like playing around with theater and performance and games, and we get to have all those weird affordances that come with it, right? So we can have that sound and nobody questions it because it's also a game. And it was really great to have conversations with the sound designers and we're going back to that conversation of, well, how do you think from one field versus another, right? Like I actually was able to have a conversation with a sound designer, a conversation I didn't think we would be able to have about like kind of making the music dynamic in the way that games make music dynamic. If you go into a certain space, a new sound might fade in or fade out, or something might happen more rapidly. And it was like a struggle because I have no knowledge about music. I play no musical instruments. But we stumbled through this conversation and it actually led to a really interesting outcome in some of the puzzles that were being built. And it was just this like really, I don't know, fun, amazing moment, which was never even planned. It just happened because we were standing next to each other. And I was like, oh, have you played this game? And that led to that conversation.
There's one interesting exception to the diegesis thing that I can think of, and there may have been others. There was a world in Terrarium at the very end that was a game show format, and we were kind of parodying reality TV. And so the idea was, even though there was one anchor in each of the other futures, suddenly in this kind of overpopulation future, there were 11 people in the room. This was pre-COVID, so we could put 11 people in a room. And the thing was, because it was a game show, in every episode you had to vote one person off until one anchor remained who could do this kind of like time communication, time travel sort of thing. We were like playing with this really creepy version of game show music. So it was like game show music from like a horror film or something. And there it actually fit. Like the glitches and the music together produced a really unnerving environment. But otherwise, I agree with everything Ash and Marc are saying.
I wanted to, there's one other question I want to ask before we go to Echo. So I don't know if we have a ton of time for it, but I'd love to hear just a few maybe peak moments of emergent community stuff that happened with the players that to you was like, this was amazing.
Like from Terrarium in particular?
Yeah, in Terrarium, like, was there anything that players did that you just were like completely blown away by or surprised by, or was like, yes, this is why we're doing this?
I mean, I think that happens in all of the games, that we get to see the communities that they build and like they start to contribute their own, fan art or materials or like lore to the world, which is always amazing. I think in Terrarium, we really were able, it was accompanied by this symposium of the Futures Design Challenge, where students were invited to form their own teams and come up with interventions into climate change. And that could be, scientific, it could be artistic. And a lot of our student designers who were working with us, who were second, third, fourth years, served as mentors for those groups of incoming freshmen. And I think that really formed these amazing relationships. And part of what we've done with research is following up with a lot of the people who participated in Terrarium and the FDC, and those kinds of connections to the slightly older students, I think were really instrumental in kind of making them feel like they had more of a space in a community on campus, which was really one of our major goals. I mean, I think we were also just blown away with some of the ideas the students came up with, where I'm like, I would fund that if I had $1 million. It was a great idea. So it was cool to see that too.
There was also a moment with Terrarium where we were listening on Discord when the players were talking, when they found the initial rabbit hole, and they suddenly realized how big the world got, and they were so excited. And designing an ARG is a present. Like it's something that you're giving, and there was a kind of understanding of that and a feeling that we are special. Like hundreds of players felt, and to us, that they were incredibly special, and they were special together, to be meeting in this Discord, which they created, that we were shills listening to, but they were so, like, they felt so special. And they started to form a community between themselves. They hadn't met yet. They're still in high school. They haven't yet started. And so friendships and connections started happening before they got together in person. And looking at that shift from high school into college and that connection and community that was based on a kind of shared love through game was really thrilling.
I think to add on to that, I think one of my favorite moments was at the end of the game when we were in World 4, going off of what Patrick was describing of this game show, and we had 11 people there. And so the goal was to kind of vote to see who is going to be the person to go into the Spore device and reset the future. And so like what Heidi's saying of like they formed their community, right? They worked together, and then we got to this end moment. This is like basically the last part before we transition to the Futures Design Challenge, where they all collaboratively decided to say, we are not voting at all. We are not making a choice here. You can't force us to do this. And I love it when a group of people just actually say, we're going to do this. We're going to stand together. No. Of course, we had to figure out, oh, okay, well, how are we going to actually make this ending happen? Because they just said no, which is its own fun thing to deal with. But like, I love to just see the fact that they haven't formed relationships with the U Chicago yet, but they are starting to do that, right? They're building community. They're getting connected to their, older peers at Chicago. And then they came together, chatted on their Discord channels and said no. And I thought that was amazing.
Very cool. Any others that you guys can think of?
Yeah, I mean, there were some really intense moments in the Parasite, which was a much earlier game, but there were moments where players would try to find the location of where we were building physical parts of the game, which would be there for live action moments on campus. For that game, because it was pre-COVID, we actually had 9 live performances after the students showed up on campus. And we had a kind of a workshop where we were building these huge sculptures for that. And a couple of students who were on campus, just through like small clues of like things that were at the fringes of video that we were sharing with them, started to like intuit where this might be. And so they started like scouring campus, like believing that it was somewhere on campus. And at one point we found them talking on GroupMe at that point, and we knew that they were coming for us. And so we had to shut off like all of the doors for them to get in. And they still ended up getting in a few days later over the weekend when they talked a security guard into being allowed in. So they went completely stealth and played this kind of like meta spy game. Wow. And rather than saying, no, you shouldn't have done that, we had to incorporate that and completely rewrite everything, which was a terror and a joy at the same time.
And I think what was even better was they got in because they brought one of their parents who told the security guard that she needed to be sure that this looked like a safe place to send a student. So the mom was involved in getting them into that too, which was even more fun, I think, for us.
One of my students in a class I was teaching used me as an ARG rabbit hole. Basically for one of their projects. That was so fun. Let's shift over a little bit and talk about Echo because I know you guys have a little demo you wanted to show. I thought it was interesting. You were in the middle of Terrarium when COVID happened, or did COVID happen after?
It happened after. So Terrarium was entirely in 2019. So it started in kind of late spring and ended in early fall. And we were not planning on doing another game so quickly, but basically in March, as we started realizing what COVID was, we realized, oh no, like students are being sent home. There's this disintegration of community, potentially. There are a lot of mental and physical health issues going on. And so we very quickly pitched a version of our next game, which was called a Labyrinth, and ran that in the spring. And then kind of did a more refined version, really a totally different story and different mechanics in the fall of 2020, and that was Echo.
Cool. Why don't we go to the Echo trailer? Nico, can you cue that up?
This is not a game.
Echo is an alternate reality game
to engage around the health pact.
Using a science fiction narrative to creatively approach COVID.
600 students, staff members, faculty members, even medical students sign up for the game.
I'm Scarlett. We don't have much time.
Echo culminated in a live online performance.
One 90-minute block of challenges and puzzles and storytelling.
We built a platform for running that performance. Live streaming video, chat, interactive puzzles. And all of those elements are sort of then suspended inside a seamless experience. Players went to a place and anything could happen.
We knew what was going to happen, but we didn't know what was going to happen. This is like a Christopher Nolan film that you had to try to catch up and piece together the parts.
Echo is fun. The quest got me and my teammates connected.
It was like a breath of fresh air for these 3 weeks.
I think we learned a lot about each other as well.
The challenges, the effort, bringing together just a lot of different groups was tremendous.
Post-COVID mediated, I mean, it looks like there was still some live stuff in this game too, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, when we did a Labyrinth, we couldn't even get into any building on campus. And so everything we filmed was pre-recorded outside and then played live where players could interact and make decisions. And we just had every possibility pre-filmed. For Echo, we were able to get into buildings in a very limited fashion with kind of a skeleton crew of designers. And whenever we had an actor on camera, basically, that would be the only person in the room. And anybody who was an engineer would be at a substantial distance, like far more than 6 feet, being able to operate the room and kind of like looking in from a distance. A lot of the game was still asynchronous and online, but there was this 90-minute finale at the very end. And this was our first time of doing a single kind of 90-minute block of live play. And the movement was, as you could see from the trailer, was moving into 3 different rooms: the story room, the puzzle room, and the magic room, and splitting the audience up into thirds so they would have slightly different experiences and could come back at the end and share those experiences and collate them, which made it feel less like a linear shared narrative and more like a world where people were having a fundamentally different experiences.
Yeah, I love that asymmetry. That's something that escape rooms do really well, I think. Do you want to show your demo?
Sure.
Okay, let me see.
We had live streaming video that happened underneath this text. This chat room had, I think at one point, about 300 people in it. We pooled that room into 3 separate rooms at one point. One room had a live stream and an extra puzzle solving interface that was built into this. Another room had a live stream that would then break down into one-on-one interaction, something more like FaceTime. And then a culminating room where everyone came back together again and interacted again with some live actors. So this was the sort of the space, the sort of full screen darkness that anything can happen in. And it's an unusual space for this time. It is text-based, which is, I guess, unusual in this sort of high bandwidth world. It's anonymous, right? There are no usernames here. You don't know how many people's in the space. You don't know if the person who said that was the same person as the person who said the previous sentence. So it's very playful for the audience. And inside the space, the playfulness is then picked up by the fact that there are tricks that you can discover. So not all text, just as there is text. There are some text do special things. So right now, people are making it snow. You can sort of discover that asteroids fall downwards. And somebody's written the word fog. There's kind of an emergent game that people can bump into where certain words that are close to the word fog can start to change the background color and ultimately invert the whole experience. So this is a very playful space. And at one point in Echo, we actually just set it up over the course of a weekend and had a quest structure that directed some players to it, and put a couple of these Easter eggs in and sort of set the quest to discover those Easter eggs. And I'd come back to the server, 2 days later and check the logs, and there'd be like 16,000 messages that had been sent over the course of a long weekend. And that is just people trying to figure out what they can do, trying to figure out what the secrets of this space are. And then you set it up next weekend, but you make the rules slightly different. So it's a very old internet, I think, way of just interacting, is sort of the weird website where you can be anonymous when you're encouraged to play, where the rules aren't clear, where you're not being tracked. It's not going part of your permanent record. And it's sort of a surprise how comforting and interesting this is in our time as a proxy for a connection.
Yeah, it's really beautiful. Is it open all the time? Can people just jump in and mess around with it? Or?
It hasn't been open for a while. I turned it on yesterday just to make sure it's
just for today. Okay,
still around.
Cool.
And it's also very transient. There's no accumulation here, so it's very hard to sort of break it. You can't sort of leave graffiti and then disappear. If you want to disrupt it, you really have to put a lot of constant effort into it. So it might be quite a safe thing to leave running.
Yeah, you never know. People will come up with ways of making it unsafe.
Yeah, as soon as we put puzzles into it, we definitely had students who were like reading the source and trying to reverse engineer it. But
I loved your story about the students trying to find your location and trying to figure out how to get around that. Cool. It's a little after 4. We don't really have a hard stop time, but I want to just check in and see if we have any questions from our Twitch audience. So I'm going to just see if our moderator has anyone out there that wants to ask you guys any questions. She's going to send them to me privately, and then I'll read them back to you if there are any. While we're waiting to see, do any of you guys have the trophy?
Ashlyn, it's probably somewhere near you.
I'd love to see it. I refer to the trophies as my babies because I usually curate them. And when I travel, I visit people, or lately I've been on Skype with people, and I usually see them like on the shelf behind them in their studios. It's really fun to see them. And yours, I'm trying to remember which one I picked that one out specifically for your project. The neat thing about,
It was a golfer.
Oh, the golfer. Yeah. Vintage golf trophy. because it's really physical. It has like I think right? It's,
Yes.
that was really fun to do. Yeah.
And it's super meta because it's like the golf. I mean, it's not a sport that I know. I worked as a caddy at one point when I was much younger because it paid reasonably well. But it's, as you can see from Ashlyn, it's like the golfer on top of the ball. So the golfer, like if the golfer hits the ball, it means that they fall over, which I love as a kind of like meta statement.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Also,
Well,
it's like a terrarium.
That's exactly why I picked it. I said, because it looked like a globe. That was the reason I picked it for you guys. And also, if you notice, it is a woman golfer.
I definitely noticed that. I noticed that immediately.
Yeah. I found an incredible amount of like vintage bowling, women's bowling and golf and like volleyball trophies when I was researching this. Excellent. No questions from the audience. Do you guys have anything else you want to say in closing? And then I have a couple of announcement type things.
I mean, just very briefly, it'll be interesting to see where this kind of work, not just what we do, but what other kind of playable theater makers are doing, where this goes in the kind of hybrid world that we're moving into with COVID. It's been interesting, like in the last year, to see these experiments, like even like Facebook Watch's Rival Peak or the PB Here phenomenon on TikTok, seeing these like ARG-like things streaming back into the mainstream. And I still think the most interesting work is coming from independent designers and artists. But it is interesting to see the mainstream starting to like pull this in some ways.
It's funny because ARGs have had this weird past. I was just corresponding the other day with the designer of Majestic, which was one of the very first ARGs, but was basically shut down because of 9/11, even before AI or the Beast or any of those that most people know as the early prototypes. But it seems like now, in part because we have this proliferation, you were talking about Discord and Twitch, and we have this whole proliferation, and people are so used to multitasking across media in a way that they weren't, 20 years ago. I mean, that was Majestic. Yeah, that was 20 years ago, I think, almost to the day. People are used to inhabiting a transmedia environment all the time now, which means that they have more access to all the different kinds of forms that we're sharing. And then, at the same time, like some of the Nordic LARP people are doing correspondence LARPs with mail, which I think is lovely. Like it's just trying to find a way to bring the liveness and the performativity and the tangibility. I've been doing some theater things lately where they send you stuff in the mail that you then have to manipulate, or they'll give you a list of props you need to bring into the session. Trying to just make sure we have a sense of like the physical world is still part of the conversation, which I think for me, theater people, my experience in working with theater makers is that it's all about the body and it's all about the physical expression. And then how can we keep that energy, like you were talking about, the energy of the theater going, even though we have all these screens and discords. I mean, I have 4 different windows of communication open now while we're doing this. So it's really an interesting time, I think, and really exciting. To me, one of the things that's been great is how people have adapted. A lot of really creative people sort of hit this wall and then went, I'm going to push past this wall and figure out how to use this as an opportunity to innovate, which is kind of what IndieCade is all about ultimately. So thank you guys so much.
Survived plagues in the past.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And I think it will.
Yeah, I think it will. It's also interesting how it's transforming though, because I feel like this is a whole other discussion we should have at some point about kind of the idea of the passive audience versus the active audience and agency. And it sort of also goes back to thinking about, Boal and the notion of empowering the audience and breaking down the hierarchy and breaking the proscenium. And you have these, promenade theater pieces, but they still don't really break the fourth wall in some cases. And so how do we sort of, and you have gamers who are used to having agency, right? So that's one of the interesting things. Like a lot of immersive theater people get annoyed by gamers because gamers are always trying to push further and, break the boundaries and solve things that don't even necessarily need to be solved, right? Somebody was telling me a story about people were trying to take a panel off a wall because they thought something was hidden there, even though there wasn't actually anything there. So, so we have to also contend with this really smart audience that can outsmart us if we're not careful, right? Very cool. Well, thank you guys so much for joining us for this kickoff of this crazy show that we started, and also probably the largest interview group I'll have this season. I don't know, maybe I'll have 4 in the next one. I wanted to make a couple of quick announcements. As I said, if people are coming in late, please subscribe to our Twitch channel. You have just been listening to the Fourcast team who created Terrarium and other ARGs at the University of Chicago. You can check them out online. I think, what is your website, Patrick? Do you have just a URL we can share?
Yeah, it's fourcastlab.com, but it's misspelled. So it's like the number 4.
Fourcast, right? Yay. Great. And the other thing I wanted to remind everyone is that the IndieCade Fun Drive is starting on February 7th. So this is how we're bringing together resources so we can bring in more fantastic programming, as well as our annual festival and other events. So thanks so much again, you guys, and hope to see you soon. And maybe we'll see you in the next IndieCade as well.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah.